Marriage in ancient Rome was not built on romance. It was built on power, family strategy, and social order. For most Romans, especially in the upper classes, marriage was an agreement between families. It was a contract that joined property, influence, and future children. A Roman wedding looked joyful on the outside. There were flowers, music, and celebration. But behind this beauty stood strict rules and strong expectations. The bride was often very young. Many girls were married in their early teenage years. The groom was usually older, sometimes much older. In Roman society, the father held authority over his family. This power was called patria potestas. It meant that the father had legal control over his children. Even when they grew up, a daughter did not choose her husband freely in most cases. Her father arranged the marriage. The purpose of marriage was clear: produce legitimate children and protect family honor. Love was not the main goal. Stability and alliance mattered more. There were different types of Roman marriage. In one type, called cammano, the bride passed fully into the control of her husband. She legally left her father's authority and became part of her husband's household. In another type, called sinmanu, she remained legally under her father's power, even after marriage. These legal differences shaped what happened later inside the household. A dowry was almost always involved. The bride's family gave money, property, or goods to the husband. This dowry helped support the new household, but it also created pressure. If the marriage failed, returning the dowry could cause conflict. Because marriage was about family honor, the bride was expected to show obedience and purity. Her reputation mattered deeply. A woman accused of dishonor could damage both families. The wedding ceremony itself was filled with symbolism. The bride wore a special dress, often white or light-colored, and her hair was styled in a traditional way. She carried tokens of good luck. Religious rituals were performed to ask the gods for blessing. But beneath the ritual, beauty was anxiety. For many young brides, the wedding marked the end of childhood. They were leaving their family home and entering a new household where they had little power. The wedding feast was joyful for guests, but for the bride it could feel overwhelming. At the end of the ceremony came the most serious moment: the symbolic transfer. The bride was escorted from her father's house to her husband's home. Friends and family walked with her, singing songs meant to bring good fortune. Yet this journey was more than celebration. It represented a change in authority. She was no longer under one household's control. She now belonged to another. Roman writers describe playful rituals during this transfer. Guests would pretend to block the door of the groom's house. The groom would carry the bride over the threshold. This was said to prevent bad luck. But behind the playful appearance stood deeper meaning. Carrying the bride showed that she entered under the husband's protection and authority. It was a public sign of control. Once inside the house, the feast continued. Guests laughed and drank. Music filled the air. But as night approached, attention turned to what everyone knew would happen next. The wedding night was not simply private romance. It carried social importance. It confirmed the marriage physically. It was proof that the union was real. For noble families especially, there was strong pressure for the marriage to be completed quickly. Producing heirs was essential. A marriage that was not physically confirmed could cause gossip. Roman society valued strength and dominance in men. Masculinity was linked to control of the household. A husband was expected to lead firmly. A wife was expected to obey. This imbalance shaped expectations for the wedding night. Ancient sources do not always describe details openly. Roman historians often focused on politics and war, not private life. However, scattered writings, legal texts, and poems reveal hints about fear and pressure surrounding this moment. Young brides, sometimes barely teenagers, entered marriage with little experience or preparation. Conversations about intimacy were limited. Education for girls focused on domestic skills, not emotional readiness. For some women, the wedding night was simply the beginning of married life. For others, it was frightening. Roman culture did not center on the idea of mutual emotional connection. The husband's authority was clear. His duty was to produce children and maintain household order. Yet it is important not to imagine all Roman marriages as cruel. Some couples likely developed affection over time. Some husbands treated their wives with respect, but the structure of power remained unequal. As we move deeper into this story, we must understand that what made these nights horrific was not always physical violence. Often, it was the pressure, the lack of choice, and the overwhelming shift of power that created fear. In the next part, we will explore the wedding rituals more closely. The songs, the symbolic gestures, and the traditions that surrounded the bride as she crossed into a new life. Because sometimes what appears joyful on the surface hides deeper realities underneath. The wedding ceremony and hidden rituals. To understand what truly happened on Roman wedding nights, we must first look carefully at the ceremony itself. Every ritual, every symbol, every word spoken during the wedding day carried meaning. Nothing was random. Everything prepared the bride for her new role. In ancient Rome, religion and daily life were deeply connected. A wedding was not just a family event, it was also a sacred ritual. The gods were invited to witness and bless the union. Families believed that without divine approval, marriage could fail. The bride's clothing was filled with symbols. She wore a white tunic tied with a special knot called the knot of Hercules. This knot was not meant to be simple to untie. It symbolized strength and protection, but it also represented control. On the wedding night, the husband would untie this knot. It was a quiet but powerful sign of authority. Overhead, the bride wore a bright orange-red veil called the flammeum. The color was meant to protect her from evil spirits. Romans were deeply superstitious. They believed that spirits could harm a bride during this important life change. But the veil also covered her face partially. It made her less visible. It created distance. In many ways, it turned her into a symbol rather than a person. Before leaving her father's house, the bride would dedicate her childhood belongings to household gods. This act marked the end of her girlhood. Dolls, toys, and simple objects from youth were offered up. It was a quiet goodbye to childhood. For many girls, this was not just symbolic. It was emotional. They were stepping into adulthood suddenly, often without time to prepare. The ceremony itself was filled with music and laughter. Guests shouted traditional phrases for good luck. One common shout was, "Talisi." The meaning of this word is debated, but it was linked to ancient stories of marriage and capture. Some historians believe it connected to early Roman legends in which women were taken as wives by force. Whether true or not, the echo of such stories remained in wedding traditions. After the formal rituals, the feast began. Wine flowed freely. Songs, wedding songs, some romantic, others teasing. Many songs were playful, but had hidden meanings. Some hinted openly at what would happen later that night. Guests would joke about the bride's innocence and the groom's strength. These jokes were public reminders that the marriage must be completed physically. As evening approached, the atmosphere slowly shifted. Laughter soft. The focus turned to the final act of the day. The bride was formally escorted to her husband's house. This was called the deductio. It was a dramatic moment. Torches lit the path. Friends walked beside her. Children sometimes carried lamps. But here is something important. The bride often pretended to resist. This was not real refusal. It was ritualized behavior. She would act shy, sometimes even cry lightly, as if she did not want to leave. Family members might gently push her forward. Why was this done? Because Roman culture valued modesty in women. A bride who appeared too willing might seem improper. So, symbolic resistance protected her reputation. It showed that she was pure and obedient to family decisions, not driven by personal desire. However, even if ritualist, this act reveals something deeper. It shows that society expected women to appear powerless in this moment. When the bride reached the groom's house, she was lifted over the threshold. Romans believed stumbling over the doorway was bad luck. So the groom carried her inside. Again, this looked romantic, but it also symbolized transition and control. She did not walk in by herself. She was brought in. Inside the home, she was welcomed to the household gods of her husband's family. She touched fire and water, symbols of domestic life. From this point on, her main world would be inside these walls. The door of the bridal chamber was then closed. Outside, guests might still be laughing, but inside, everything changed. The wedding chamber was prepared carefully. The bed was decorated. Sometimes special prayers were spoken. In wealthier homes, female relatives or servants helped prepare the bride. But here's what ancient writers do not describe in joyful detail. The bride was often very young. The groom was usually older and experienced. The difference in age created imbalance. She entered this room not only as a wife, but as someone expected to fulfill duties immediately. In Roman law, the marriage became fully binding after physical union. Consummation confirmed the legitimacy of future children. This created strong pressure on the first night. If the bride showed fear, it was often dismissed as natural modesty. If she resisted seriously, it could cause scandal. The expectation was clear. The marriage must be completed. Roman writers, like poets, sometimes described wedding nights as moments of transformation. They used soft language, speaking of flowers, doors opening, and bonds being tied. But poetry hides as much as it reveals. For many women, this night was not guided by emotional connection. It was shaped by duty. It is important to understand that Roman society did not view the husband's authority as cruel. It saw it as natural. A man leading his household was considered proper order. Yet modern readers can see how heavy this burden must have felt for a young bride. Some scholars believe that in certain periods, witnesses might even wait for signs that the marriage had been completed. While not a constant practice, the pressure of proof existed strongly in the culture. Virginity was tied to family honor. A bride who was not believed to be pure could bring shame. This fear added another layer of anxiety to the night. Thus, what happened on Roman wedding nights was shaped by law, religion, superstition, family honor, and strict gender roles. The horror was not always in dramatic violence. It was in the system itself. A system that gave one person full power and gave the other little choice. When the door of the bridal chamber closed, the public celebration ended. The laughter of guests faded into the distance. What remained inside that quiet room was not music, not poetry, not romantic dreams. It was expectation. For Roman society, the wedding night had one clear purpose: confirmation. The marriage had to become real in a physical way. Without this act, the union felt incomplete. Family honor, inheritance, and future children all depended on it. For the groom, this night was proof of manhood. Roman culture valued male authority and control. A husband was expected to lead his household firmly. Strength and dominance were seen as virtues. Showing hesitation could damage his image. For the bride, the situation was very different. Many brides were extremely young, sometimes only 13 or 14 years old. Some may have been emotionally unprepared. Education for girls focused on household skill, spinning, weaving, cooking, not on emotional readiness for marriage. There were no open conversations about intimacy. Mothers might give advice quietly, but such talks were often brief and indirect. Roman society valued modesty in women. Speaking openly about desire was seen as improper. So when the bride entered the chamber, she carried not knowledge, but uncertainty. The room itself was symbolic. The bed represented fertility. Flowers sometimes decorated the space, symbolizing growth and new life. But the beauty of the setting did not remove the pressure inside it. The groom held legal power over his wife, especially in marriages cum mano, where she entered fully into his authority. In those cases, she had little legal independence. Even in sin manu marriages, where she remained under her father's legal control, daily life still placed her under her husband's dominance. Consent, as we understand it today, was not clearly defined in Roman marriage customs. The marriage was arranged by families. Agreement between fathers was central. The bride's personal feelings were rarely the focus of historical records. This does not mean that every wedding night was violent or cruel. Some husbands may have acted gently. Some couples may have formed bonds of respect and affection over time. Roman letters and inscriptions show that love did exist in some marriages. But the structure of the system gave one side more power, and power shapes behavior. In some Roman writings, the bride's fear is described almost as expected behavior. Poets wrote of trembling brides, shy glances, and nervous silence. These descriptions were often romanticized, yet beneath the poetic language lies something serious. Fear was normal. Fear of pain, fear of failure, fear of disappointing family expectations, fear of losing status. If the bride did not bleed, questions could arise about her virginity. Though modern medicine shows that bleeding is not universal, ancient societies believed it was proof of purity. This belief created enormous anxiety. Reputation was fragile. A rumor could damage not only a woman but her entire family. Because of this, Silence surrounded the experience. Roman historians wrote in detail about wars, emperors, and political struggles, but private experiences of women were rarely recorded directly. Their voices were mostly absent. We learn about these nights through law codes, poetry, and indirect comments. The silence itself is telling. It suggests that what happened inside the chamber was not meant for public discussion. In upper-class families, the pressure to produce an heir quickly was strong. A woman's main duty was to bear legitimate children. If she did not become pregnant within a reasonable time, whispers could begin. Blame often fell on the woman. Divorce in Rome was legally possible and not uncommon. A husband could end a marriage relatively easily. A wife could also initiate divorce in certain circumstances, especially in later periods. But social pressure remained powerful. The imbalance did not end with the wedding night. It shaped daily life afterward. The Roman household was built on hierarchy. At the top stood the paterfamilias, the senior male head. Below him were wife, children, and slaves. Obedience was expected. For a new bride, the wedding night was the first step into this strict structure. Some historians argue that the real horror was not one single act, but the system of limited choice. A girl who had little say in her marriage could not easily shape her own future. Her body became tied to family strategy. Her fertility became a resource. Her obedience became a measure of honor. Yet it is important to avoid exaggeration. Not all Roman men were harsh. Inscriptions found across the Roman world show husbands praising their wives as loyal, kind, and beloved companions. These examples remind us that human relationships are complex. Even within unequal systems, personal kindness can exist. Still, we must look at the broader pattern. Roman law allowed fathers to arrange marriages early. Society celebrated male authority. Public rituals reinforced female modesty and silence. All of this created an environment where the bride's personal feelings were secondary. The phrase erased from history does not mean that events were deliberately destroyed. It means that the emotional reality of these women was rarely recorded. Their fears were hidden behind ritual language and poetic metaphors. When we read ancient texts, we see grand descriptions of weddings as joyful celebrations, blessed by the gods, but we rarely see the inner thoughts of the bride, and that absence speaks loudly. The wedding night marked the end of childhood, the beginning of duty, an entry into a male-controlled household. For some women, it may have been manageable. For others, it may have been deeply distressing. The horror was not always dramatic. It was structural. A system where youth, silence, and obedience were expected created vulnerability. As the Roman Empire grew stronger, its traditions became more formalized. Marriage laws changed over time, especially under emperors who wanted to encourage childbirth among citizens. These laws increased pressure on women to marry and produce children, so the private wedding chamber was connected to the public strength of Rome itself. Power, control, and life after the wedding night. When the sun rose after the wedding night, the public celebration was over. But for the bride, a new reality had just begun. What happened in that chamber was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a life shaped by law, tradition, and power. Marriage in ancient Rome was not only about two individuals. It was about structure. It was about hierarchy. And once the wedding night confirmed the union, the bride stepped fully into that structure. In many households, especially under the older form of marriage called kamanu, the wife legally became part of her husband's family. She was no longer under her father's authority. Instead, she stood under her husband's legal control, similar in some ways to a daughter within his household. This meant that property rights, legal decisions, and daily authority rested largely with the husband, even in sin manu marias, where a woman technically remained under her father's power. Her daily life was still centered in her husband's home. Her world became domestic. Roman society valued the ideal of the obedient wife. She was expected to manage the household, supervise slaves if the family was wealthy, raise children, and protect family honor. Public life belonged mostly to men. Private life belonged to women. But even private life was not truly private. Reputation mattered deeply in Roman culture. A woman's behavior reflected on her husband. If she was seen as disobedient or unfaithful, it could damage his standing in society. This created another layer of control. Adultery laws were strict, especially during the time of Emperor Augustus. He introduced moral reforms that punished adultery severely. A husband who caught his wife in adultery had legal rights to divorce her and even seek punishment against her partner. For women, the consequences were serious. Social shame, loss of dowry, and exile were possible outcomes. Meanwhile, male infidelity was judged more lightly in many situations. This double standard reveals the imbalance clearly. The wedding night symbolized possession. After that night, the wife's body was linked directly to family legitimacy. Any child she bore would carry the family name. Therefore, her loyalty was not just emotional, it was political and economic. If a woman failed to produce children, tension could grow. Roman society placed high value on fertility. Women who remained childless could face blame, even when the cause might not have been theirs. Divorce was possible and relatively common in some periods of Roman history. Unlike in many later societies, Roman divorce did not always carry extreme social destruction. However, it still placed women in a vulnerable position. If divorced, the woman might return to her father's house. Her dowry could become a source of legal dispute, and her reputation might suffer, depending on the reason for separation. We must understand that the horror described in dramatic stories is not always about extreme violence. It is about limited freedom. A young girl who entered marriage without choice now lived inside a system where obedience was expected. Her opinions were secondary. Her movements could be monitored. Her friendships might be restricted. Even daily routines were shaped by expectation. She rose early. She managed tasks. She presented herself modestly. Public appearance required careful behavior. Yet, Roman women were not entirely powerless. Some women, especially from wealthy families, found ways to influence politics behind the scenes. Letters and inscriptions showed women who managed estates, advised husbands, and even shaped decisions quietly. In later periods of the empire, women gained more legal independence, especially under sign manual marriage. They could own property and control wealth more directly. But these legal freedoms did not erase social pressure. The memory of the wedding night remained symbolic. It marked the start of a life where personal desire was expected to align with family duty. And what if a wife resisted authority? Roman law allowed husbands to discipline their households. Extreme cruelty was not officially encouraged, but authority was clear. Society rarely questioned male dominance unless it became scandalous. The emotional experience of women during these years is difficult to recover fully. Ancient texts were written mostly by men. Female voices appear rarely and indirectly. However, small clues survive. Inscriptions on tombstones sometimes show husbands praising wives as faithful, modest, and devoted. These words reveal what society valued most. Notice what is missing: independence, ambition, personal dreams. The ideal Roman wife was quiet strength inside the home, not visible power outside it. Over time, Christianity began to spread through the Roman world. Christian teachings emphasized spiritual equality in certain ways, but they also reinforced marital duty and obedience. Marriage became even more sacred, less about contract and more about divine bond. This shift changed some rituals, but did not remove male leadership from the household. When historians today look back at Roman wedding traditions, they see layers of meaning. On the surface, there were flowers, torches, songs, and laughter. Beneath that, there was transfer of authority. Beneath that, there was social control. What made these wedding nights erased was not a conspiracy to hide them. It was the silence around women's inner lives. The public record celebrated empire and conquest. It rarely paused to ask how a young bride felt when the door closed. Power in Rome was visible in armies and emperors, but it was also visible in the quiet control of households, and that control began formally on the wedding night. Why this story was quiet, and what it really reveals when we look back at ancient Rome. We often see power, glory, and greatness. We imagine huge armies marching across Europe. We picture grand buildings, marble temples, and cheering crowds in massive arenas. Rome is remembered for strength, but history often remembers what is loud. It remembers battles. It remembers victories. It does not always remember quiet rooms. The Roman wedding night did not disappear from history because someone destroyed the records. It became erased because it was considered ordinary. It was part of daily life, and daily life, especially the private lives of women, was rarely written down in detail. Ancient historians such as Livy or Tacitus focused on politics and war. They wrote about senators, generals, and emperors. They rarely described how a teenage girl felt when she left her childhood home forever. This silence is powerful. When something is repeated so often in a society, it stops being questioned. Roman marriage was normal. The authority of the husband was normal. The expectation of obedience was normal. And what is normal is rarely examined. But today, when we look back with modern understanding, we can see the emotional weight hidden inside those traditions. The wedding night in Rome symbolized more than romance. It marked a shift of control. It confirmed that a girl had entered adulthood under male authority. It connected her body to family honor and political strategy. The horror was not always dramatic. It was quiet and structured. It was the pressure of expectation. It was the fear of failure. It was the silence around personal emotion. Many Roman brides probably accepted their role because society taught them from childhood that this was their destiny. Religion supported it. Law supported it. Family supported it. When every voice around you says something is natural, it becomes difficult to imagine another path. Yet history also shows change. As the Roman Republic turned into the empire, marriage laws evolved. Some women gained more control over property. In certain periods, elite women became powerful figures behind the scenes. They influenced politics, advised emperors, and managed vast estates. This reminds us that even within strict systems, individuals find space to act, but the foundation of marriage remained built on hierarchy. The wedding night stood as a private ceremony inside a public contract. It was the moment when the agreement between families became physical reality. Why does this matter today? Because how a society treats its most private moments reveals its deepest values. Rome valued order, lineage, and authority. Marriage supported all three. The bride's personal feelings were secondary to the stability of the household. That does not mean Roman society was uniquely cruel. Many ancient cultures arranged marriages early. Many valued family alliance over personal romance. Rome was not alone in this. But Rome left behind detailed legal records and cultural traditions. Through these fragments, we can piece together the experience behind the ritual. When modern storytellers describe Roman wedding nights as horrific, they are often reacting to the imbalance of power. They are reacting to the youth of many brides. They are reacting to the absence of open consent as we define it today. Yet we must be careful not to imagine constant brutality where evidence does not prove it. The truth is more complex. Some marriages likely grew into partnerships of respect. Letters from Roman couples show affection. Tombstones carved with loving words reveal emotional bonds. Human beings are capable of kindness, even inside strict systems. But systems still matter. A system that gives one side authority and limits the other shapes outcomes. It shapes expectations. It shapes silence. And silence is part of this story. For centuries, historians repeated grand narratives of Roman greatness. Only in more recent times have scholars asked deeper questions about daily life, especially the lives of women. When we ask what happened on Roman wedding nights, we are really asking something bigger. Whose experiences are considered important enough to record? In Rome, public power was visible. Private vulnerability was hidden. The image of a bride carried over a threshold looks gentle and romantic in art. But behind that image lies a moment of irreversible change. A young girl stepped from one world into another, guided by traditions stronger than her own voice. That is why the story feels intense today. Not because every wedding night was filled with violence, but because choice was limited, because power was uneven, because emotion was rarely recorded. History often celebrates the conquerors, but true understanding comes when we also listen for the quiet stories, the ones whispered behind closed doors. Roman wedding nights were not erased by fire or destroyed by enemies. They were hidden by normality. And sometimes, what is normal in one era becomes shocking in another. When we study these traditions, we are not only studying Rome. We are studying how societies shape gender roles, power, and family structure. The grand temples of Rome still stand in ruins. The Colosseum still attracts millions of visitors. But the silent rooms of Roman houses are gone. What remains are questions. Questions about authority. Questions about consent. Questions about how far tradition should go, and perhaps the most important question of all, how will future generations judge the private customs of our own time? History is not only about the past, it is a mirror.